My parents gave me $500 and kicked me out after my golden sister was born. But 17 years later? I 35 meters, work as a software engineer at one of the major tech companies on the West Coast. After nearly a decade in the industry, I finally built a stable life for myself, good salary, comfortable apartment, and even some investments for the future. From the outside, it probably looks like I'm living the American dream. But recently, something happened that's been forcing me to confront my past, and I'm struggling with how to handle it. My parents, 60 meters, 58F, contacted me after 17 years of complete silence, asking for my help with my sister, 13F. To understand why this is such a big deal, you need to know our history. I was never the child my parents wanted. They had been trying for a daughter for years before I was born, and they made no secret of their disappointment when they got me instead. Growing up, I often overheard them referring to me as a spare or a remnant when talking to relatives or friends. My mom was a high school teacher and my dad worked in real estate, so we weren't poor, but they always acted like my existence was draining their resources. I have vivid memories of family gatherings where relatives would try to convince my parents to be grateful for having a healthy son. My aunt would say things like, "At least he's smart and well-behaved," or "Many couples can't have children at all." But my parents would just brush these comments off, saying things like, "Unless it's a girl, we don't really have a child yet." I learned to make myself scarce during these conversations, but their words still cut deep, especially during holidays or family events. When I was in middle school, I started getting really interested in computers and programming. I'd spend hours in the school computer lab, teaching myself coding from whatever resources I could find online. My computer science teacher noticed my passion and started mentoring me, even letting me stay late after school to work on projects. But when I tried to share my accomplishments with my parents, they just nod absently or change the subject to their ongoing attempts to have another child. Everything changed when I was 15. After years of trying, my parents finally had their miracle baby, my sister. The moment she was born, it was like a switch flipped in our house. Suddenly, there was joy, celebration, and love. Just none of it was directed at me. They poured everything into her. Their time, money, attention, and affection. I understood she was their priority, but the contrast in how they treated us was stark and painful. I still remember when I won first place in a state-level programming competition during my junior year. The prize included a small scholarship for college. When I came home with the trophy and certificate, my parents barely looked up from cooing over my sister trying to stack blocks. But when she managed to put 3 blocks on top of each other, that warranted a family celebration with cake and pictures. At school, I threw myself into coding and my studies, knowing education was my ticket to independence. I started doing freelance web development work on the side, hiding the money I earned because I had a feeling I'd need it someday. That instinct proved right when my 18th birthday came around. Instead of any kind of celebration, my parents sat me down for what they called an important discussion. Looking back, I think they've been planning this for a while. They explained that they needed my room for my sister's playroom and educational space. They had already decided I would move out immediately. When I tried explaining that I needed time to save money and find a place, they shut me down completely. According to them, I'd had plenty of time to prepare, and should be able to manage on my own. My dad handed me an envelope with $500, what he called startup money, and told me I had until the weekend to leave. This was on a Tuesday. I packed what I could into my old high school backpack and a few garbage bags, some clothes, my laptop, and the money I'd secretly saved from my freelance work, about $3,000. I remember my sister, just 3 years old then, watching from the hallway as I packed, not understanding what was happening. Those first few years were brutal. I couch surfed between friends' places, careful not to overstay my welcome anywhere. I worked multiple jobs, overnight shifts at 7-Eleven, day labor at construction sites, freelance coding whenever I could find clients. I'd sleep in public libraries during the day between jobs, using their computers to look for better opportunities and teach myself new programming languages. I lived on ramen noodles and whatever was on sale at the dollar store. There were nights I went to bed hungry, not knowing if I could afford my next meal. The worst part was during winter, when I'd sometimes have to choose between paying for a warm place to sleep or having enough food to eat. Despite everything, I still tried to maintain some contact with my parents during those early years. I'd call them occasionally, hoping for even the smallest sign that they cared about my well-being. But every conversation was short and uncomfortable, with them clearly waiting for it to end. They never asked how I was doing or if I needed anything. When I mentioned I was taking community college classes while working, they just said that's nice and changed the subject to my sister's preschool achievements. After 2 years of being the only one reaching out, I stopped trying. They never called to check on me, never sent a message during holidays or birthdays. Not even when I finally got my first real tech job after teaching myself full stack development. I remember wanting to tell them so badly that I'd finally made it, but their number had already been disconnected. Those early years after being kicked out taught me invaluable lessons about survival and self-reliance. While juggling multiple jobs, I never stopped coding. During my breaks at the convenience store, I'd study programming documentation on my phone. Between shifts at construction sites, I'd work on small freelance projects at the public library. The library became my sanctuary. Free Wi-Fi, air conditioning, and most importantly, access to computers where I could practice coding. My break finally came when a small startup took a chance on me as a junior developer. They were impressed by my portfolio of freelance work and my contributions to open source projects. The salary wasn't great by tech standards, but it was life-changing for me. For the first time, I could afford a tiny studio apartment and didn't have to worry about where I'd sleep each night. I threw myself into the work, putting in 70-hour weeks and learning everything I could. Database management, system architecture, cloud computing, I absorbed it all like a sponge. My colleagues noticed my dedication, and soon I was leading small projects. During nights and weekends, I continued contributing to open source projects and building my own applications. It wasn't just about the money anymore. I'd found something I truly loved doing. The real turning point came when one of the major tech companies noticed my contributions to their open source platform. They reached out with an interview offer, and after 6 rounds of technical interviews, I landed a position that completely changed my life. 7 years later, I'm now a senior software engineer leading a significant project team. I have a modern apartment in a secure building, a healthy investment portfolio, and enough savings to feel confident about my future. I thought I'd finally close the chapter on my past until 3 days ago, when my father's number appeared on my phone. After 17 years of complete silence, hearing his voice was jarring. He sounded older, desperate even. He said they needed to talk about my sister, and it couldn't wait. What followed was a conversation that left me reeling. My sister, now 13, is apparently in serious trouble. She's been caught shoplifting multiple times, regularly skips school, and hangs out with a crowd of older teenagers my parents don't approve of. More worryingly, they found drugs in her room twice, and she's had several run-ins with local law enforcement. She's already been through 3 different rehabilitation programs, none of which seemed to help. The real reason for their call became clear when my father brought up their financial situation. They've spent over $200,000 on various treatment programs, counseling sessions, and legal fees. They've remortgaged their house, maxed out multiple credit cards, and sold most of their valuable possessions. Now they're looking at a specialized long-term treatment facility that costs $75,000, and they're desperate for help. My mother got on the phone, crying, saying they had nowhere else to turn. She kept repeating how family needs to stick together and that I'm their only hope for saving my sister. The irony of hearing these words from the same people who kicked me out at 18 and never looked back hit me hard. Where was this family unity when I was sleeping in my car between couch surfing arrangements? Where was it during those countless nights I went to bed hungry? They're asking for help with the treatment program costs, plus assistance with their mortgage payments and credit card debt. In total, they need almost $100,000. My father even suggested setting up a payment plan if I couldn't provide the full amount immediately. I'll be honest, I could help them if I wanted to. Years of living frugally and smart investing have left me in a stable financial position. But the thought of giving them access to my finances makes me physically ill. This is money I earned through years of hard work and sacrifice, often going hungry and homeless while teaching myself to code. The complexity of this situation keeps me up at night. Part of me feels guilty for even hesitating to help. My sister is just a kid, after all. She never asked to be born into this mess, and maybe if someone had been there for me during my teenage years, things would have been different. But then I remember how my parents treated me, how they kicked me out without a second thought, and never once checked to see if I was alive or dead for 17 years. Yesterday, they called again, asking to meet in person. They said they want to explain everything and make things right. They suggested meeting at an upscale restaurant in my area, offering to drive the 4 hours to see me. Something about their eagerness makes me uneasy, like they're trying too hard to manipulate the situation in their favor. My girlfriend, 34F, thinks I should maintain firm boundaries. She's seen firsthand how hard I've worked to build my life and heal from my childhood trauma. She's worried that letting my parents back in could undo years of emotional progress. My best friend, who let me crash on his couch during those rough early years, says I don't owe my parents anything but suggests I consider helping my sister directly if I want to. Right now, I'm completely torn. The logical part of me says to maintain the distance that has allowed me to thrive. My parents haven't changed. They still see me as a resource to be used, not a son to be loved. The way they're approaching this situation, focusing on the money rather than attempting to make amends for the past, speaks volumes about their true intentions. But the emotional part of me can't stop thinking about my sister. A troubled teenager who might be acting out because of the same toxic family dynamics that I escaped. Am I perpetuating the cycle of abandonment by refusing to help? Or would helping just enable my parents' manipulative behavior? I've worked incredibly hard to build a life I'm proud of, one that those scared nights sleeping in my car taught me to never take for granted. Now I feel like I'm being dragged back into the chaos I spent years trying to escape. Do I help them and risk getting pulled back into their manipulation? Do I try to help my sister directly somehow? Or do I maintain the boundaries that have allowed me to heal and thrive? Whatever I decide, I know I'll question it. If I help, I might resent them for pulling me back in. If I don't, I might always wonder if I could have made a difference in my sister's life. The weight of this decision is crushing, and I could really use some outside perspective. Update 1. After reading your comments and suggestions, I decided to meet my parents at a coffee shop downtown. I figured a public place would help keep things civil and give me an easy exit if needed. The moment I saw them walk in, I was struck by how much they'd aged. They looked exhausted, with dark circles under their eyes and noticeably more gray hair than I remembered. They wasted no time getting into details. My sister's issues are apparently worse than they initially described over the phone. Beyond the substance use and legal troubles, she's had to go through multiple rehabilitation programs, all of which they've had to pay for out of pocket. She's not just skipping school occasionally, she hasn't attended a full week of classes in months. She sneaks out regularly, often disappearing for days at a time with friends who are clearly a terrible influence. My parents showed me their financial records on their phones. They weren't exaggerating about their situation. They've sold most of their valuable possessions, including my childhood home, to cover these expenses. They're now living in a small apartment and struggling to make ends meet. They even mentioned selling some family heirlooms, which they estimate will only keep them afloat for a few more months. Throughout our conversation, there was this underlying expectation that made me uncomfortable. They kept bringing up family obligations and my duty as their son to help out. It felt like they thought that no matter what they'd done in the past, I would step up simply because we're related. The way they talked made it clear they hadn't really processed how they'd hurt me or even acknowledged their past treatment. As they kept going, I could feel all my old anger and resentment bubbling up. They didn't see any of this as their fault. They brushed off kicking me out at 18, saying it was just parenting, and they'd done what was best for the family at the time. They acted like it was perfectly normal to treat me the way they did, and now they expected me to forgive everything and swoop in to fix their problems. I realized they weren't looking for forgiveness or understanding. They were looking for a solution. And to them, that solution was my money. They needed someone to take on the financial burden of all the decisions they'd made over the years, and I was their last resort. After listening to everything they had to say, I told them firmly that I couldn't help them. I explained that I'd worked hard to build a life on my own after they left me stranded, and I wasn't in a position emotionally or ethically to support them now. I made it clear that I didn't feel any obligation to bail them out of a mess they'd created themselves. They didn't take my refusal well at all. Their faces hardened, and their tone changed completely. They called me selfish, said I was abandoning my family, and accused me of being heartless for not helping my sister. I could see the anger and disappointment in their eyes. It was like looking back into my childhood. Nothing had changed. They were still trying to guilt me into feeling like I owed them something. I left that meeting feeling more conflicted than when I went in. Part of me feels relieved that I set a boundary and stood up for myself. But another part feels guilty. Like maybe I'm turning my back on them when they're at their lowest. It's hard to explain, but even though I know they hurt me deeply, it still feels strange to walk away from them like this. I keep thinking about their situation and about my sister, who I don't even know. I feel sorry for her, but I don't believe I can save her. It's painful to realize that even after all these years, my parents don't see me as an individual with my own life and struggles, but instead just as someone they can use to fix their problems. I'm trying to let go of the guilt, but it's hard. Am I wrong for sticking to my decision? Should I have tried to find some middle ground? I keep replaying the meeting in my mind, wondering if I made the right call. Update 2. Things have gotten even crazier since my last update, which was only about a week ago. Just a few hours ago, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I heard my sister's voice for the first time. This caught me completely off guard. I barely know her, with only vague memories from when she was a baby right before I left home. The call started surprisingly well. Her voice was polite, almost sweet, which was unexpected given everything I'd heard about her behavior. She began by asking me to help our parents with their current financial situation. I could tell she'd rehearsed this pitch because she was laying it on thick about how they were struggling and how I could save the family. I tried to keep my response respectful but firm, explaining that my relationship with our parents was complicated and that I had to make decisions that were best for me. That's when everything changed. Her demeanor flipped like a switch. She went from polite to furious in seconds. starting to accuse me of being selfish and abandoning her with all the responsibility of dealing with our parents. She kept saying I was turning my back on my family and had always been jealous of her. According to her, I was acting superior because I'd gotten away and started my own life while they'd been the ones supporting me all along. Her words shocked me. They sounded eerily familiar, almost like she was reciting something she'd heard many times before. Besides, she spoke with such entitlement about my help, as if she genuinely believed it was my obligation to step in and fix everything. I was so taken aback that I couldn't even respond. Here was this person I'd never had a relationship with, demanding that I make up for years of choices I had nothing to do with. After her emotional outburst, she hung up before I could process what had just happened. I sat there, staring at my phone, trying to make sense of it all. Where was this hostility coming from? Why did she think I'd abandoned her? I needed answers. I called my parents, determined to understand what was going on. As soon as they picked up, I asked them directly if they'd been telling my sister that I'd abandoned her and them. There was a telling pause before they finally admitted the truth. For years, they'd been feeding my sister a completely twisted version of why I left. They told her I couldn't handle sharing their attention with a younger sibling and had cut ties with them out of spite. They'd painted me as a selfish older brother who abandoned the family because I was jealous of her. The reality, that they'd made me feel like an outsider from the me. All these years, my sister has grown up believing I was the villain in this story. No wonder she felt like I'd abandoned her. She'd been raised on a steady diet of lies about who I was and why I left. Meanwhile, the truth about my parents making me feel unwanted from birth and forcing me out of the house had been carefully hidden from her. I hung up on them after that revelation. They haven't tried to reach out again, but then again, it's only been a few hours since our last conversation. I'm angry at my parents for lying to my sister about me and for making her think I was the one who walked away. But I'm also frustrated with my sister for lashing out at me and demanding my help as if I owe it to her. This resentment is hard to shake off, but now I'm also feeling a different kind of guilt. I wish my parents had told her the truth about why I left. Maybe if they had, things would be different between my sister and me. I might not have been able to help my parents financially, but I definitely would have been able to build some kind of relationship with my sister and possibly help her avoid some of these behavioral issues. But now it feels like there's too much damage to fix. I'm not even sure if I want to try. This whole situation is exhausting because just when I thought I was done with my family for good, they came back in the worst possible way. I know many comments have suggested I just block my parents and move on completely, but it's not that simple for me. Call me whatever you want, but this is still family, and I feel like I need to know what's going on, at the very least. I'm definitely in no position to help my family out financially, but this is the first time they've reached out to me, and part of me can't ignore that completely. Still, it's clear to me that my parents are still trying to manipulate the situation to get what they want, and my sister is too wrapped up in their version of the story to see things differently. I don't know what else to do. I can't help feeling like any choice I make will be the wrong one. The way they've twisted the narrative of my departure makes me even more certain that maintaining my distance is the right choice, but it also makes me sad for my sister. She's grown up with this distorted view of family history, and it's clearly affecting her behavior and relationships. I wonder if there's any way to repair this damage, or if it's better to just let it be. Update 3. It's been a few months since my last update, and I've had a lot of time to reflect and let things settle down. Honestly, it's been quieter for me, but only because I made the choice to stay out of the mess my parents and sister have created. I'm learning that sometimes the best way to find peace is by stepping back and not letting their drama consume my life. About a month after my last update, my parents called again. I was dreading it, but I picked up because I wanted to hear what they had to say this time. They were even more desperate than before and used every tactic they could think of to guilt me into giving them money. They talked about how dire things were, how they were on the verge of losing everything, and how they needed me to step in and fix it. At first, they tried the whole family is supposed to stick together guilt trip again. When that didn't work, they switched to threats, saying they would make my life miserable if I didn't help them. Then they changed tactics again, claiming I was their only hope now. Honestly, I was disgusted. After everything that happened, they still had the audacity to threaten me, and not once did they stop to acknowledge how badly they had treated me. I stood my ground and told them again that I couldn't help them financially and that it wasn't my responsibility to fix their problems. I reminded them that they had made these choices, and it wasn't on me to clean up the mess. They weren't happy about that, obviously. They kept calling for the next month, alternating between guilt trips and threats. Eventually, they stopped calling. I figured they had finally realized I wasn't going to cave. For a month, I didn't hear anything from them. And honestly, I thought that might be the end of it. But then, just about a week ago, I got another call. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity got the better of me. The situation had only gotten worse. They told me they had to declare bankruptcy. They'd sold almost everything they owned to cover their debts and were basically starting over with nothing. Then they dropped another bombshell. My sister had completely cut contact with them and moved in with one of her friends. She's only 13, but somehow she managed to move in with a friend's family who, according to my parents, enables her bad behavior. When I asked why they didn't get the authorities involved, they said it was for the best, that my sister no longer lived with them because they couldn't see themselves helping her anymore. So they've essentially abandoned their second child as well. At first, they tried to put the blame on me. They said that if I had just helped them out when they asked, none of this would have happened. They claimed I was the reason everything went downhill. Of course, they couldn't admit that they were responsible for their own actions. I was beyond angry. I told them straight up that everything happening to them was a result of their own decisions and the way they had treated me. I reminded them of how they kicked me out when I turned 18, how they treated me like a second-class citizen in my own home, and how they ignored me when I needed them. I reminded them about how they didn't even acknowledge how that affected me and instead just kept trying to shift the blame onto me. That's when they finally stopped making excuses and started backtracking. They apologized and said they regretted everything they had done to me. They told me they wished they had done things differently. It felt like they were saying all the right things, but it was too little, too late. I couldn't just forget how they had treated me for years, and I couldn't erase the fact that they had destroyed 2 lives, mine and my sister's. They had pushed me away, and now they were reaping the consequences of that decision. I felt pity for them. I honestly did, but at the same time, I knew I couldn't sacrifice the life I built for myself to try to fix things that were already broken. I told them I couldn't offer any help and that I needed to keep my distance. They were upset, but I stayed firm in my decision. After I hung up, I still felt angry at them for what they did to me, but at the same time, I was sad for them. I wish they had taken the time to see what they were doing wrong when they had the chance, but now it's too late. I've made my peace with the fact that I can't save them, and that's something I'm learning to live with. I don't know what the future holds for them or for my sister. All I know is that I'm not going to let their mistakes ruin my peace. I've come too far to let them pull me back into their chaos. Maybe over time, I'll try to reach out to my sister again and see if I can help get her on the right track. But for now, I have much bigger things to worry about. I can only hope that she learns from all of this and makes better choices than our parents did. So, yeah, that's about it for me. It'll be a long while before I check in on my family again. I know this isn't exactly the happiest ending, but it's something that I've made peace with.